All right, so first thing I want to ask you is why exactly did the conflict occur? Um, what in particular were the disagreements that led up to it?
For a long time, there had been a lot of unhappiness among the unionized workers at the Free Press. Um, and like I tell my students, it's always about the money. If they say it's not about the money, it's about the money. Uh, Mostly we felt we were being underpaid. There had not been any raises for a while in the union contracts, and I would say that was the main issue. Each union in the bargaining unit probably had its own particular specific issues, but certainly for the newspaper guild, it was about the money. I really can't speak because I can't remember what the issues were for the Teamsters and the mailers and whichever other unions were involved. I think at that point they had pretty much eliminated the typographers. There were no more printers at the Free Press, so that union was gone. And I think for the companies, they would have been thrilled to have eliminated the unions altogether.
I had also heard that the partnership between the news and the Free Press also had some things to do with the strike. That partnership caused some tension.
I think what happened with the partnership was the union said, look, these guys have gotten together and they're not really competing on the business side because the business side is a joint operation. They've got the joint operating agreement. I think for the first time in many years, they were assured of profitability. And the unions basically felt, we'd like some of that for our work. Always the companies have pleaded poverty. Today, they are pleading poverty, I think, legitimately. But back then, we did not believe it was legitimate. And in fact, this may come up later in your questions, but one of the reasons I believe fairly early on that the strike was doomed was that about a month after we walked out, Gannett spent something like $1 billion, billion with a B, to buy another company, and Knight Ridder, which owned the Free Press, spent something like $100 million to buy another company. And I thought, well, if they've got between them $1.1 billion to buy other companies, they can just wait us out indefinitely, and whatever amount of money the Free Press is losing and the news is losing is relatively insignificant to these giant corporations that have this kind of money to spend on acquisitions.
I also wanted to get a sense of what your position was. From what I've heard, there were a lot of splits and divisions. Not every reporter necessarily sort of kind of went on strike. Some people decided to stay in the newsroom. And I wanted to get a sense of where exactly you stood.
Yeah, I can tell you where I stood and where other people stood, and it was across the spectrum. I think initially nearly all of us went out on strike. There were a couple of people, and I'm going to invoke the name of somebody who's dead who can't correct me if I'm wrong, and I apologize. Bob Talbert was a columnist at the Free Press. I believe he did not go out on strike. I believe he stayed on the job. But most people went out, at least initially, and that includes folks with whose names you would know today. Mitch Albom, for example. Some people who were at retirement age decided they didn't want to go through the strike. They didn't want to be on strike. They didn't want to break the strike, and they retired. They took retirement. first week of the strike, I was actually on vacation, so I actually got paid for the first week of the strike because that was my vacation. Where did I stand? I was a good union member of Local 22, the newspaper guild. Before that, I'd been a member of Local 41 of the newspaper guild in Providence. I went out on strike. I thought the timing of the strike was ill-advised. We went out in July, in the summer of 1995. During the summer, advertising revenues are pretty light at the newspapers. Some of us thought we should have waited until November, December, when all the big holiday ads come in, and that we could really have some effect on the newspaper had we done that. There was some provocation, and I can't recall what it was, that the company had done, and the newspaper guild, that other union, said, okay, that is unacceptable, and we're walking off. It, in my opinion, was ill-advised. We should have waited until November, December. But to get back to your original question, there were people who went back to work within a few days of the strike. There were people who went back all across the spectrum. I went back after about 5 months because I realized the strike was not going to accomplish anything, and indeed it did not accomplish anything. There were people who stayed out for a couple of years till the bitter end. And one of the things that happened afterward, my wife has always said that when you would go into the Free Press newsroom after the strike, it was like the Liberty Bell. The first thing you noticed was the crack. That there was a very palpable rift between people who went back early, people who went back later, people who stayed out the whole time. Friendships were destroyed in the strike. Mostly, between people who were in the union rather than union and management folks. I think the union folks understood the management folks were doing what they had to do. Management people felt that union folks were doing what they had to do, so the animosity was not so much between labor and management after the strike had ended.
You were speaking about how the environment had changed. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. How exactly did the newsroom change? I mean, how exactly?
After the strike, or in the times leading up to the strike, would change what time period do you have in mind?
I guess what I'm asking is, you spoke about this rift in the newsroom between
Yes.
people who came back and people who didn't, and I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more on that.
There were friends who didn't talk to each other, people who had been close. They do the work. It's not like we tried to sabotage each other, but there were hard looks and few words on some occasions. It took many years for that to dissipate.
Another thing is, I'm imagining that if people didn't all go back to work at the same time, that that a lot of people had to cross a picket line.
Yes.
And I was just sort of kind of wondering what that experience might have been like.
It was unpleasant. People would call you names, people would yell at you, call you scab. People who liked you, people that you liked. But everyone did what they had to do. I mean, I was on the picket line for 5 months, and then I was crossing the picket line. So it was hard all around for all concerned. It was sad. It was not a happy place.
You also said that towards the end of it, right before you went back, you felt that the strike wasn't necessarily going to accomplish anything. I sort of kind of want to get a better sense of what you felt that the strike was going to accomplish going into it.
Well, I think idealistically and in a perfect world, we all hope that we would prevail, we would bring the company to its knees, they would lose so much money that they would say, all right, we will meet some of your demands. Nobody thought they'd meet all of our demands. In any kind of a labor negotiation, you ask for more than you expect to get, and the company offers less than it expects to give. I think we all hope we would get raises and perhaps more vacation days, better health care, all of those things. The company brought in a lot of replacement workers in 1995, within a couple of months after the strike began. And I know one thing the unions were hoping was that when we came back at the end of everything, they'd get rid of the replacement workers. That didn't happen. So that was another cause of animosity in the newsroom, that there was a bunch of workers who had come in during the strike. And they were very much resented by the people who stayed out.
I'm sort of kind of curious about how those workers necessarily worked in the newsroom. I'm just sort of kind of trying to get a sense of
the replacement workers.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a sense of, because basically what I've read up until this point stated that the companies had a plan where, in advance, where if there was a strike, they would bring in workers from other newspapers.
You know, they may have done that briefly, but then they just hired people from wherever. And it was a chance for a lot of people who had worked at, or who were working at smaller newspapers to jump up, a couple of grades kind of before their time and work at a large newspaper like the Free Press or the Detroit News. Both newspapers in those days were a lot bigger than they are now in terms of circulation. Before the strike, actually before the JOA, which went into effect in the late 80s, the News and the Free Press between them had a circulation of about 1.5 million every day. Now I think it's lucky if they're lucky if it's 500,000. So for the replacement workers who were coming up from Hilton Head, South Carolina, this was a big jump.
How do you think the strike affected the business end of how newspapers operate? A lot's changed since then. A lot has changed since then.
You bet.
And from what I've read, and it definitely was a little bit biased, that